The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
Now I want to talk about how NATO is thinking about cyber defense today. I think NATO has been in the headlines, obviously, so much given the Russian invasion of Ukraine. NATO is now getting ready to possibly expand if they can get past issues with Turkey to include Sweden and Finland, who have both submitted applications. I think everyone's been focused on how NATO is looking at cyber these days. And I can't think of a better person to talk to about that than Stephanie Metka. Stephanie is joining us from Brussels for a conversation with another one of our SIG principals, Stuart Solomon, who is president of Recorded Future. I'm going to go ahead and welcome the both of you and turn this over to Stu to lead this conversation. And I want to thank you both so much for sharing these insights on how NATO is looking at cyber defense. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Suzanne. And Stephanie, you know, as Suzanne introduced, operating at a breakneck pace, I can't imagine anybody else quite literally in the world other than you who is working day and night. So we'll be very judicious with your time, but really, really appreciate it. And forgive me for this ridiculous light thing going on in the background there, but I guess we'll be okay. Stephanie, I've had occasion to speak with you a number of times over the last few years, and it's just absolutely remarkable the way that you shrink big to small and then turn it into actionable and bite-sized chunks of data, a true intelligence professional. Maybe we could start really quickly with what is your actual remit and how does that operationally come into focus?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Stu. And I'm sorry, because I have a similar background behind me and I'm a little bit afraid that it might actually fall on me. So apologies ahead of time in case that happens. If you'll allow me to give you the meandering answer, I can kind of put the functions of our branch into context because it's really evolved and changed as NATO cyber defense policies have evolved. Way back in 2002 at the Prague summit, cyber was first placed on the political agenda, and it was determined that NATO needed its own network defense capability. And so NSERC, the NATO CERT, was created. And while we still retain those original incident response related functions, our mandate has grown significantly since that time. There have been a number of significant milestones along the way, including the 2010 strategic concept agreed at the NATO summit in Lisbon, which recognized for the first time that cyber attacks could reach a threshold that threatens national and Euro-Atlantic prosperity, security, and stability. So to understand this threat, NATO created their first cyber threat intelligence function to translate the technical threats to a higher level audience for policymakers and decision makers. But perhaps the most significant development for the work that we do came in 2016 at the Warsaw Summit, when NATO recognized cyberspace as a domain of operations alongside the traditional domains of air, land, and sea. And this enables NATO's military commanders to better protect missions and operations from cyber threats. And for us, working alongside our military J2 colleagues, we now had the added responsibility of operational threat intelligence and situational awareness for military leaders. So at present, we encapsulate operational and strategic assessments, situational awareness, information sharing, threat discovery, capability development, and incident management. And we have a broad spectrum of audiences and stakeholders who are reliant on that information.
Yeah, so I would love to delve into that a little bit because there's so many things that trigger in my mind when you go through that broad of a remit, and obviously the evolving notion that this turns out to be a relevant component of the overall battle space, in fact, in that cyber paradigm. But let's start with some basics and then we'll get even more specific. At the basic level, how do you build an intelligence product that ultimately influences military, diplomatic, and political decisions across such a disparate population of systems and beliefs?
That is a dense question, but I have a relatively simple answer. Like, intelligence is critical to the alliance. It's important for the decision-making process. So as I mentioned, like, we have the cyber intelligence function for the entire NATO enterprise, and we need to be able to provide technical information to network defenders because we still have that very first primary responsibility to defend NATO's own networks from cyber attacks. We have to provide intelligence for operational battlefield commanders and then the strategic level for ambassadors and decision makers. We really take a more granular bottom-up approach. We start with the technical. Most of the intelligence, cyber threat intelligence, is operational technical data, and it's just the insights that you derive from that change the context for different audiences. So as I mentioned, it's a bottom-up approach, and we're really just trying to translate what's happening in a technical domain for people who need to make those, I guess, understand the political and military consequences of it.
Got it. So as you're doing that, it seems to me that there's also a time horizon component to this as well. So as you're kind of transitioning from strategic to operational to tactical intelligence development, there's also an element of near-term or immediate use cases versus medium or even longer-term decision-making use cases. How do you balance your time there? And does it materially change the products that you create?
Yeah, I mean, we create a variety of products. I think a lot of it is driven, though, by what's on NATO's immediate priority area of focus. So there are long-term policy initiatives that we have to keep a pulse of, pay attention to, so that we can support policy making, decision making along the way. And those come out usually annually in terms of like summits and ministerials and things that are going to be providing a larger context for the policy work. But it's inevitably shaped by what's happening in current events. And so oftentimes we're just a very operational team trying to put out situational awareness products, operational intelligence, because things are changing quickly and we need to be able to react to that in real time.
Got it. So given that scenario where there's constantly shifting intelligence requirements, to your point, as well as the different levels, let's geek out for a second from an intelligence perspective, which is, and this is something I'm always contemplating, we can produce the best possible intelligence, but if it's not consumable and actionable, then it's just interesting, and interesting doesn't keep people coming back for more. So when you think about making people good consumers of intelligence, how does the team start to craft either its product or its approach to be able to actually create a better consumer on the other end of this, so that it actually affects informational decision making?
So I think it goes back to knowing your stakeholders, knowing your audience. We spent a lot of time getting to know ours. So how do we ensure that network defense data is being fed into, like CM solutions, so that we can defend ourselves in real time, versus how do we brief committees? How do we prepare presentations, reports, products to support NAC decisions, and making sure that once we put our assessments out there, that they're actually being used. It's been NATO started operationalizing this domain in 2016, and it's been a process. It's been a journey along the way to ensure that we're hitting the mark with all the different stakeholders. I think when we talk about strategic decision making and making sure that our customers are actually getting the best products from us and using it in the best way, this has really been a priority for NATO, at least for the cyber domain, since about 2020, when we started a massive adaptation process to try and bring the cyber components together to make decisions based on technical data. And I think one of the best examples of this would have just last week, the national cyber coordinators were convened in the North Atlantic Council to have a conversation about broader deterrence and defense in cyberspace. So I think in my time here, we've at least seen an evolution and adoption of cyber being a very technical topic that not a lot of people viewed outside of the network defense remit, to a domain of operations, and it's being put into military plans and adaptation, to now we're having very policy level senior discussions in the council on cyber.
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. I'd love to pull the thread on that a little bit. I think many of us are starting to become more adept at really two elements of intelligence applications. So geopolitical and the ramifications of intelligence to be able to influence geopolitical decision making, and then on the very tactical side, how to start applying it to network defense scenarios. Granted, there's a massive skill gap that needs to be filled in the application thereof, but I think it's garnering quite a bit of attention and budget to go along with it. My question, though, as you just described last week, there's a much bigger discussion around this notion of deterrence versus defense, and where you put your energy and effort around that. How is that impacting your intelligence mission right now as you start to apply it to these very unique use cases?
It's a great question. And yeah, one that's still very relevant. So our job is to inform the people who shape NATO's deterrence and defense posture on what is happening in cyberspace and how to prepare for what's next. Everything that NATO does is threat informed, and that includes how we prepare for competition and conflict in the cyber domain. The conversation with the cyber coordinators last week was extremely fruitful, and I think it's clear, at least from my perspective, that there is a broad recognition of our need to learn from the events in Ukraine and incorporate those lessons into our overall cyber defense posture. And I think this conversation is going to continue because at the Madrid summit next month, it's expected that cyber defense will be reflected in NATO's next strategic concept.
That's really interesting, actually. So, it's just fascinating to watch the application of things that we would say go down that path of the defense and deterrence components in a really unique way. I was just jotting down a note for myself to circle back on that later. So, as you contemplate these scenarios, let's start to look a little bit at what you're seeing in the Ukrainian theater right now. And obviously that's been dominating quite a bit of your time and informing the broader strategic decisions that we're making. But there was obviously a series of activities that led to the precursors to the kinetic events that we see today, as well as, frankly, a lot of technical precursors that led to the events of today as well in the Ukrainian theater. How did your team begin to gather intelligence requirements and build out an exercise and prepare for really being able to jump both feet into the fire in this point in time?
So we are paying attention to everything that Russia does, and we had been monitoring the situation long before the invasion began. My colleague and I were actually on the ground in Ukraine at the beginning of the year to exchange views, and we have been in constant contact with our Ukrainian counterparts since. I guess getting to your point about how things have changed for us, there has been a significant increase in the demand for our assessments. And as I've mentioned previously, we serve the spectrum of NATO cyber intelligence needs. So we've spent a lot of time ensuring that everyone from the North Atlantic Council to the CERT is receiving timely and actionable intelligence to fulfill their various mandates. I would stress that our ability to serve such a wide demand would not be possible without the levels of proactive sharing from allies, from industry partners, and from Ukraine itself. Our success is really a collective success. And at the risk of sounding cliche, cyber is a team sport.
No, it definitely is a team sport. I agree. The reality is there's far more information than there is ability to process and use that information. So trying to triangulate is particularly important. Are there areas of focus that surprised you along the way that you've had to kind of ramp up quickly to be able to effectively manage, or are things pretty much progressing the way that you had prepared?
I mean, I have to apologize because I wasn't here for the earlier session. So if I'm touching on things that have already been discussed, I think one of the biggest misconceptions that we had or have had during the crisis is that cyber didn't happen. And I think because everyone had these extreme notions that, the lights would go off and all the critical infrastructure would go down, and there would be these big moments of cyber attacks that would, and when those didn't materialize, there was a general consensus that cyber was not occurring. But the truth is, and when I speak to people on the ground in Ukraine, there's a lot of cyber activity that's happening all the time. And probably we'll never know the full extent of it until we try to turn the computers back on and see if they're still working. My colleague actually drafted a foreign affairs article called "The Myth of the Missing Cyber War." And I think it really explains from NATO's perspective the fact that there are a lot of cyber attacks happening below the visibility. A lot of attempts against critical infrastructure in terms of railways, in terms of places that process border transit points that were thwarted. The attacks were happening, but they were stopped. They weren't able to execute their full extent. And you saw that with, I think, 8 or 9 separate wiper attacks in a 6-week period. I can't think of a single time in history where we had 8 wiper attacks in a year, let alone a couple months. So there has been a significant amount of cyber. I think we didn't see it play out the way we thought we would, and that has led us to think that it's not happening, but it has been happening and it's still happening.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and let's kind of converge on that point a little bit. With activity going on a little bit less than, from a less dramatic perspective than people realize, doesn't mean it's not happening, number one. And then number two, very similarly, if you extrapolate away from the battle space and you move into the implications of the cyber activity in Ukraine into Western businesses, as an example, do you see that there's also crossover, spillover scenarios that Western businesses should be contemplating as well? Or said perhaps in an even broader net, we're looking at things through the perspective of diplomatic, political, and military, but is there also an economic component that we should be contemplating?
I think for businesses, threat actors are going to get in, and your ability to bounce back matters just as much as your defenses, and we've certainly seen that with Ukraine. Businesses need to invest in resilience as a first order of priority and build strong partnerships that can provide surge capacity in a time of need. Any organization can get caught in the spillover of an emerging conflict, such as the one we're seeing right now in Ukraine. And the time to invest in preparation is now. Lessons taken from the current crisis show that cyber attacks are often front loaded at the beginning, and oftentimes you won't see them before they happen.
Yeah, great point. At the end of the day, it all boils down to preparation and resiliency. And I like to say, always think about impacts. So even if you're not being uniquely targeted, if you look at a particular technique or procedure that's being used by a cyber adversary, and you look at the tools that they have at their disposal and the impact that they could create, if you're susceptible to that impact, you should pay attention, even if you're not the target. And so using the lessons learned from particularly the cyber activity that we're seeing in Ukraine as a way to think about our own resilience miles away and from a completely different vertical and different perspective on the attack surface still comes to the same outcome, which is be prepared. So no, I appreciate that insight. I'm curious, so we're talking a little bit about Ukraine and Russia, but I'm interested, there are plenty of other nations and plenty of other security concerns outside of Russia. How does NATO partner with other entities, whether they have applications to become members of NATO or they're completely outside of NATO's theater of operations, say, particularly moving into the Pacific Rim area as an example? Where does NATO play in that overall intelligence mission?
I think it's important to remember that cyberspace is borderless. So we're paying attention to the global cyber threat, not just the Euro-Atlantic cyber threat. And we proactively work with all of NATO's partners around the globe. The levels of engagement vary depending on the frameworks in place, but we see it as essential to engage and share perspectives on emerging threats of all type. And looking forward, the spectrum of strategic competition will include not only the established cyber powers, but an emerging series of actors contributing to a threat landscape that will be more constant, more severe, and more global.
Makes sense. Are there any areas of the globe where you are really dipping your toe into right now more than others, where you see threat patterns beginning to emerge, or is it really a blanket coverage need that you have?
I mean, I think right now a lot of our time and attention is being spent on the current crisis affecting NATO allies and partners, but that's not to say that we're turning a blind eye to other actors, including other actors who are interested in that crisis and using it to their own advantage. So still maintaining a very global outlook of what's happening in the cyber threat landscape.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, harkening back to my comment earlier around impact analysis, I think that there's another paradigm of cyber activity that we should always keep in mind, which is whether you're a sophisticated nation state actor or you're a criminal actor, you're going to eventually, of course, develop unique or elegant scenarios to be able to prosecute a target, but it's much better just to use what works. And the lower barrier to entry is sometimes very attractive to even the most sophisticated actors to be able to create an outcome that they want, regardless of the uniqueness of the attack pattern or perhaps the use of a 0-day. So with kind of those two things in mind, I think it's a great place to start to wrap up the conversation a little bit. But I'm curious to get your ultimate perspective. We have a collection of both public and private sector individuals from around the globe here with us today. Would love to get your perspective of what would you as a leader in the intelligence community want to tell us, and much more importantly, what would you ask of us so that we can help to provide this this ecosystem of protection that you've alluded to through the conversation?
I mean, it's simple from our perspective. Information sharing. Cyber is a domain that rewards initiative, and proactive sharing and engagement are absolutely vital for maintaining a step up. Countries that do not mind acting irresponsibly in cyberspace will have advantages to act quicker with less resources and with greater freedom of maneuver. That being said, NATO is an alliance, and we benefit from the ability to act together. Principles of collective defense are a cornerstone for our security and resilience in the virtual domain, and continued efforts to share intelligence, reinforce one another, and engage on how to improve our collective posture will almost certainly leave us better prepared for what's next.
So you heard it here first, public-private partnership.
Absolutely.
I'd really like to thank you guys so much. Stuart, I kind of feel like you were literally reading my mind on that question of the public-private relationship, because we have heard several speakers today already, including Rob Joyce, the Director of Cybersecurity at the NSA this morning, Robert Hannigan, the former head of GCHQ, talking about the importance of that public-private sector relationship. So I am curious, just to go one more level on that one with you, Stephanie, if you don't mind, and kind of more broadly, how would you describe NATO's engagement with the private sector? You already said that information sharing is kind of key. How can companies, or how should they be thinking about engaging with NATO?
So as I mentioned, one of our mandates is information sharing, and that's not just information sharing amongst NATO stakeholders or amongst allies and partners. It's also with industry partners. And I'll say, like, quite candidly, when it comes to the intelligence that we've received from Ukraine, we're getting so much of it quicker with better context because it's coming from industry and they can share it more freely. And a lot of what they're seeing is because their telemetry is so broad in certain areas, and they can share insights and like relevant critical decision-making points with us in a very timely and effective manner. So we one of our roles is NSERC Coordination Center. That is part of the NATO Industry Cyber Partnership, NICP, and that's probably the best entry point to have begin the conversation of how to share information with NATO.
And we did hear earlier from Robert Hannigan saying that really kind of the open source technology that was being shared so widely has really changed the future of NATO of conflict. Stuart, I just want to turn the tables on you really quickly because, you're president of Recorded Future in the private sector, and Stephanie gets to sit back and take an easy pass on this one. But I just want to kind of see your thoughts about how you think that the open source sharing that obviously is so important will change the future of conflicts like this.
Well, so first of all, I think that there's a couple of ways, and without sounding self-serving about it, I think one of the most important is there's a completely unique and different funding scenario associated with investing in progression of the technologies necessary to share at scale. So, there's a very basic notion that it turns out that access to too much information is actually a bad thing.
Yeah.
So how do you take information and shrink it into those actionable or bite-sized chunks, I think is really important. A, that's not easy. B, that's expensive. And so it takes private industry to go and solve for this big data problem at scale that then makes the mechanism of sharing much more feasible and easier to do. So we want to incentivize that opportunity and then turn that back into a way to be able to then, in a pinpoint fashion, deliver those actionable insights into the hands of the people that need them most. So I think the very first step is it turns out that government cannot innovate, and it's not necessarily incentivized to innovate or funded to innovate at the same speed that private industry is. So we find a way to enable that and then enable the crossover of the data from there.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about that, I'm sure, again, a little bit later this afternoon with Sue Gordon, who, of course, is a former Principal Deputy Director of Intelligence, ODNI, because that's one of the themes that she hits on every single time I talk to her. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. I just want to thank you both so much. I think this has been really insightful. I think just getting inside the head, Stephanie, if you will, of how NATO is thinking about cyber threats and how it's working with partners, not just NATO partners, as you pointed out, is really helpful for all of us in kind of understanding this a little bit better. So I want to thank you for your time. It's a little later in the day in Brussels. We appreciate your hard work. And Stu, thank you so much for jumping right in there in the moderator role. I think these conversations are so valuable when they're kind of at an expert to expert level. So thank you both for doing this for us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.